2 hours after our daughter was born, my husband refused to hold her and confess to a secret son. So I smiled, said nothing, and let him walk straight into a trap he never saw coming. 2 hours. That's how long it took my husband to look at our newborn daughter and choose another woman's son over her. I remember the exact sound of the door when Julian came back into the room. It didn't creak. It never creaked. Everything in that hospital had been engineered to be quiet, and I hated it, because quiet meant I heard every word clearly. He was still in his gray coat. He hadn't taken it off since he walked in, like some part of him already knew he wasn't staying. "Ren," he said, "we need to talk before my parents get here." I was holding Ivy against my chest, still wrapped in the striped hospital blanket, still smelling like every newborn smells, like something that hadn't touched the world yet. My body ached in ways I didn't have language for. My hands were shaking, but not from fear, from exhaustion, from 22 hours of labor that had ended 40 minutes before he walked back through that door. "Talk about what?" I said. The room smelled like antiseptic and the particular sweetness of hospital-grade lotion, and somewhere down the hall a monitor beeped in a rhythm I'd stopped noticing hours ago. My mother had just stepped out to get coffee. The nurse, a woman named Odette, who'd been with me through the last 4 hours of pushing, had left to check on another patient, promising to come back and check my blood pressure within the hour. It was just the three of us then, me, Ivy, and Julian, standing at the foot of the bed with his coat still buttoned, like a man about to catch a flight rather than a man about to become a father. He didn't sit down. He stood at the foot of the bed with his hands in his coat pockets, and he said the words like he'd rehearsed them somewhere between the parking garage and the elevator. "I already have a son with someone else," he said. "I'm not signing anything for this baby." I didn't cry. I want to be honest about that, because for a long time I thought that not crying meant something was wrong with me. It didn't. I looked down at the plastic bracelet on my daughter's wrist, the one with her weight and the time of birth printed on it in blue ink, and I said very quietly, "Then remember this moment. Don't be dramatic, Ren." He said it the way he always said it, bored, slightly disappointed in me, like I was the one being unreasonable. I looked at Ivy instead of looking at him. She had his mouth. I noticed that first, before anything else, before the shape of her nose or the color of her eyes. She had his mouth, and something in my chest folded quietly, like a building collapsing from the inside, floor by floor, with no sound reaching the street. "Her name is Vivian," he said, almost bored, like he was reading off a grocery list. "The boy is 4 months old. My family already knows. 4 months. I did the math without wanting to. 4 months before Ivy was born, put it in the middle of my second trimester. The week I'd had a scare with my blood pressure, and Julian had told me he couldn't come to the appointment because of a site visit in Asheville. He left without touching her, I told the nurse later, when she came to check my vitals and asked gently if everything was okay. He didn't even look at her face. The nurse didn't say anything. She just squeezed my shoulder and adjusted the blanket around Ivy's feet, and I understood that she had seen this before, in one form or another, in a hospital that saw 400 deliveries a month, and probably more heartbreak than anyone wrote down. What Julian didn't know, standing there in his gray coat with his rehearsed sentence, was that I hadn't spent the last 11 years of my marriage simply being his wife. I'd spent them noticing things. A second phone charger in his car that didn't match his phone. A property in Asheville held under an LLC I'd never heard him mention. Small inconsistencies in expense reports he thought I never looked at. Because why would I? Because I was just his wife, not the person who did this exact kind of work for a living. I'm a forensic accountant. I trace money for people who've been lied to. I don't accuse anyone without a file. And by the time Julian stood at the foot of my hospital bed and told me about his son, I already had one open, even if I hadn't admitted that to myself yet. That night, after they moved me to a recovery room, and Ivy was finally asleep in the bassinet beside me, my phone rang. A number I didn't recognize, area code local, calling at 9:40 on a Tuesday night. "Mrs. Ashgrove, my name is Margot Delacroix. I'm an estate attorney. I'm calling about your Uncle Gerald's will." My Uncle Gerald had died 6 weeks earlier of a stroke in his sleep in the same small brick house outside Charlotte he'd lived in since before I was born. I'd cried at his funeral more than I'd cried at almost anything in my adult life, and I hadn't expected to hear from his estate again. I'd assumed the modest things he'd left me, his mother's ring, a set of woodworking tools, $11,000 in a savings account, had already been settled. "Your uncle left you something more substantial than the ring," Margot said. "A partnership stake in Ashgrove Holdings. It was never formally dissolved. Ren, you may have more power in that company than your husband realizes." I sat up so fast I woke Ivy in the bassinet, and she made a small, indignant sound, the kind newborns make when the world moves without asking permission first. "Don't sign anything," Margot said. "Don't say a word to Julian. I'll send a courier at dawn with the documents." I sat there in the dark hospital room, my daughter's breathing the only sound besides the hallway monitors, and I felt something shift in my chest that wasn't grief. It was closer to gravity, like the floor had finally stopped tilting. The next morning, Julian came back. Fresh shirt, different tie, soft voice, the kind he used when he wanted something. "Can I see her?" he asked. I laid my hand flat on the folder that had arrived an hour earlier, the one Margot's courier had left with the front desk, thick enough that the nurse had commented on it when she brought it in. "What is that?" he asked, nodding at it. "Something your family should have told you existed a long time ago." His jaw tightened. I had watched that exact tightening for 11 years, across 100 small disagreements, and I knew what it meant. He was recalculating. "We can talk like adults about this," he said. "We are," I said. "You're just not used to being on this side of it." He reached for the folder. I didn't move it. I didn't need to. My stillness stopped his hand a few inches from the cover, the way stillness sometimes does more work than any words could. "You'll find out Thursday," I said. "14th floor. Bring your father." He looked at me for a long moment, and something crossed his face that I hadn't seen in years. Not love, not even anger. Something closer to fear. The specific fear of a man realizing the ground he's been standing on was never quite as solid as he believed. He left. I heard his footsteps pause in the hallway outside, just for a second, like he was deciding whether to come back. Then they kept going, and I listened to them fade until the hospital swallowed the sound completely. I want to explain how I got there, how a woman who once believed, completely and without irony, that she'd married the right man ended up sitting in a hospital bed 40 hours after giving birth, calmly telling him to bring his father to a boardroom on Thursday. It didn't happen in one night. It happened over 11 years. In 100 small moments I convinced myself didn't add up to anything, until the night they did. I was 23 when I met Julian Ashgrove, in the fall of my last year at Whitmore University, in a study room on the 3rd floor of the business library that smelled like burnt coffee and old carpet. I was working on a forensic accounting elective, tracing fabricated numbers through a fictional company's books for a case competition. He was 2 years ahead of me, already interviewing for a position at his father's firm, already wearing the kind of watch that told you a person came from money before they said a word about it. He was charming in a way that didn't feel like performance at the time. He asked good questions. He remembered small details from earlier conversations, the name of my childhood dog, the fact that I hated cilantro, the exact date my father had passed away 3 years before we met. I mistook that attentiveness for depth. It took me a decade to understand it was something closer to strategy, a habit of collecting information about people because information was leverage, and leverage was the only currency his family had ever really valued. We married on June 14, 2014, in a garden venue outside Charlotte that Sinclair Ashgrove, Julian's father, had insisted on paying for in full over my mother's quiet objections. I didn't understand at the time what that gesture cost me later. Sinclair didn't give gifts. He made investments, and investments came with expectations. Sinclair Ashgrove had built Ashgrove Holdings from a single strip mall purchase in 1994 into a real estate and private equity firm worth, by the time I married into the family, somewhere north of $400 million. He was the kind of man who filled a room before he said a word, who complimented you in a way that felt like an inspection, who remembered exactly who owed him what and made sure they remembered too. My own family had none of the Ashgrove polish, and I love that about where I came from more than I ever admitted to Julian directly. My father worked as a high school shop teacher for 26 years before his heart gave out when I was 20. My mother taught piano lessons out of our living room in a modest brick ranch house in Matthews, and every dollar in our household had a name and a purpose before it ever arrived. I think that upbringing is part of why forensic accounting suited me so naturally. I grew up watching my mother balance a checkbook by hand at the kitchen table every Sunday night, teaching me, without ever framing it as a lesson, that money tells the truth about a household even when the people inside it don't. Our wedding day itself, in hindsight, contained a small preview of everything that would define the marriage. Sinclair had insisted on a garden venue in Waxhaw that cost, I later learned from an invoice I found by accident 3 years in, just under $90,000, a number my own parents, sitting quietly at their assigned table that day, could never have imagined spending on a single afternoon. My mother had tried gently to contribute something, offering to cover the flowers as her gift to us. Sinclair had waved her off at the rehearsal dinner, in front of both families, with a warmth that felt, at the time, generous. "Nonsense," he'd said. "This is our gift to Julian. Consider it an investment in his future." I remember my mother's face in that moment, a flicker of something she never fully named to me until years later, after everything had come apart, when she finally told me she'd felt, even then, like Sinclair was buying a piece of me along with the venue, and that she'd never quite been able to shake the feeling for 11 years afterward. My uncle Gerald had been Sinclair's original business partner, back when Ashgrove Holdings was 2 men and a rented office above a dry cleaner on South Boulevard. Gerald had put up half the original capital in 1994, $60,000 he'd saved working as a machinist for 11 years, and in exchange, he'd taken a founding partnership stake. In 2003, when the company was restructuring for its first major expansion, Gerald sold back the majority of his position for $210,000, a number that had felt enormous to him at the time, and modest to everyone else by the time I married into the family. What almost no one remembered, because it had been buried in a side letter attached to a restructuring agreement more than 2 decades old, was that Gerald had kept a residual 13% founder's stake, non-dilutable, meant to convert to a buyout only if certain conditions were triggered. Sinclair's lawyers, in 2003, had apparently assumed the position would lapse quietly, the way founders' shares sometimes do, when nobody bothers to formalize the paperwork. Gerald never brought it up. He wasn't the kind of man who pushed. He worked in his garden, fixed his own truck, and never once, in the 11 years I knew him as my husband's uncle by marriage, mentioned that he technically still owned a piece of the company that had made the Ashgrove family wealthy enough to buy a wedding venue in cash. I should have paid closer attention early on to how Sinclair treated Gerald at family gatherings. There was a particular tone Sinclair used with him, warm on the surface, dismissive underneath, the tone of a man speaking to someone he'd successfully outmaneuvered a long time ago and never wanted reminded of it. I thought it it was just personality. I understand now it was guilt wearing a friendly face. The early years of my marriage were good, or at least good enough that I didn't examine them too closely. Julian worked long hours at Ash Grove Holdings, climbing from analyst to associate to, eventually, vice president of acquisitions. I built my own career at Whitfield & Cross Forensic Group, first as a junior associate combing through spreadsheets for signs of embezzlement, then as a senior forensic accountant testifying in depositions about wire transfers and shell companies. We bought a house in the Elmhurst neighborhood, 4 bedrooms, a kitchen I loved, a driveway long enough for both our cars. We talked in our 3rd year of marriage about children, though Julian always found reasons to wait. A deal closing, a promotion pending, his father wanting him fully settled at the firm first. There was one incident in our 4th year of marriage that I filed away and told myself didn't mean anything. I was going through our joint credit card statement, a habit from my job, checking numbers the way other people check locks on doors, and I found a charge from a boutique in Asheville, $340 at a lingerie store I'd never heard of. Dated the same week Julian had told me he was in Raleigh for a conference. When I asked him about it, he barely paused. "It's for my sister," he said. "Her birthday's coming up. I didn't want to tell you because I know you two don't really get along, and I didn't want it to be a thing." His sister's birthday was in October. This was March. I noted the discrepancy, said nothing, and let it go, because the alternative, that my husband was lying to me about where he'd been and who he'd been with, felt too enormous to hold while also holding down a full-time career and a marriage and a life I'd built around the assumption that he was fundamentally decent, even when he was difficult. That's the thing about the kind of man Julian turned out to be. He was never cartoonishly cruel. If he had been, I would have left years earlier, the way anyone would. He was subtle. He weaponized reasonableness. He'd make you feel, in the moment, like questioning him was the unreasonable act, like your instincts were the problem, not his behavior. I have spent a long time since then thinking about how effective that particular skill is, and how many women I know have described some version of the exact same experience with some version of the exact same kind of man. Sinclair, for his part, treated me with a specific brand of warmth that I mistook in the early years for genuine affection. He asked about my career at dinners. He complimented my analytical mind in front of guests. It took me almost a decade to understand that Sinclair complimented people the way a chess player compliments an opponent's opening move, as a way of tracking their capabilities, not as a form of respect. By our 8th year of marriage, the small inconsistencies had started to accumulate into something I could no longer fully ignore, even if I still hadn't named it. Julian's trips to Asheville increased in frequency, always tied to a property the company owned there, always described in the vaguest possible terms. Site visit, due diligence on the lodge parcel. I found once a business card wedged behind his driver's license in his wallet while looking for a parking validation ticket. Cream cardstock, a single word in a serif font. Larkspur, no other information beyond a phone number. I asked him about it, and he told me it was a boutique realty group handling some tax structuring work for the Asheville property. I remember thinking at the time that the name sounded like something out of a wedding invitation, delicate and floral, not like anything Ash Grove Holdings normally worked with. I remember thinking it, and then filing it away, the same way I'd filed away the lingerie charge 4 years earlier, because I had built an entire professional identity around trusting numbers over feelings. And yet in my own marriage, I kept letting feelings talk numbers out of the room. I want to be honest about the good years too, because I think it matters, and because a story that only remembers the warning signs isn't telling the whole truth about how a marriage actually convinces a person to stay in it. For the first 5 years, Julian was, in most of the ways that mattered day to day, a genuinely present partner. He learned to make my mother's cornbread recipe for my birthday the 2nd year we were married, badly at first, then well enough by the 4th try that she asked him for the method. He drove 3 hours each way, twice in 1 month, when my father's old heart condition flared up and my mother needed help managing his medication schedule. He remembered every single year without being reminded, the anniversary of my father's death, and he'd leave a single stem of white lily on my nightstand before he left for work that morning. A small, quiet gesture that never once, in 11 years, required me to ask for it. I bring this up not to soften what came later, but because I think it's the honest reason the later years were possible at all. You don't stay quiet for a decade about a man who never gave you anything worth protecting. You stay quiet because you're protecting something that was, for a long time, genuinely good. And you keep hoping the good version is still in there somewhere, buried under whatever his father is asking of him that week. The specific incident I think of now as the true beginning, the first thread that should have told me everything, happened in our 6th year of marriage, 18 months before the lingerie charge I mentioned earlier. Julian's college girlfriend, a woman named Camille he'd dated for 2 years at Whitmore before we met, resurfaced briefly on a business trip to Nashville, where she now worked in commercial real estate. He mentioned, casually, over dinner the week he got back, that they'd grabbed a drink after his conference wrap. For old time's sake, nothing weird about it. I remember believing him completely, without a flicker of doubt, because at the time I still operated on the assumption that my husband told me things by default, rather than only when confronted with evidence he couldn't root around. It was Sinclair, oddly enough, who let something slip at a dinner 2 months later, mentioning offhand that Julian's Nashville trip had been extended by 2 days, for personal reasons that Sinclair assumed I already knew about. I hadn't known. When I asked Julian, he told me Sinclair was simply confused about the dates, dates, that there had been no extension, that his father mixed things up constantly at his age, a claim that struck me even then as strange, given that Sinclair Ashgrove was, at that point, 61 years old and ran a $400 million company with what everyone in his orbit understood to be an unforgiving memory for detail. I let it go. That's the sentence that recurs most often in this story, I realize, telling it now. I let it go. I want to say I've made peace with how many times I said that sentence to myself, but the truth is I still find it sometimes, sitting uncomfortably in my chest at 3 in the morning, the specific shame of having been the kind of person who could see a pattern clearly in someone else's finances and refused to see the same pattern in her own bedroom. The escalation, when I look back on it now, moved in 5 distinct stages, each one feeling at the time like the worst it could possibly get, each one turning out to be a floor above a floor I hadn't known existed. The first stage started in the spring of our 9th year of marriage, when Julian was promoted to Senior Vice President of Acquisitions, and Sinclair began speaking about him at every family dinner as the future of the company, a phrase that always made Julian sit up a little straighter and made me, without fully understanding why, feel a small cold drop in my stomach. With the promotion came more travel. Asheville trips went from once a month to nearly every other week. I asked him, over dinner one night in April, why a residential lodge parcel required that much ongoing attention 2 years after the initial acquisition. You wouldn't understand the zoning complexities, he said, not looking up from his plate. It's not like your work, where the numbers just sit there waiting for you to find them. I let that sit in the room for a moment before I answered. The numbers don't just sit there, Julian. That's the whole point of my job. Someone always tries to make them disappear. He laughed, a short, dismissive sound. It's a joke, Ren. Don't turn everything into an audit. I told myself he was tired. I told myself the promotion had stretched him thin, that a man under that much pressure from a father like Sinclair was allowed a little irritability. I made him a cup of coffee, and we didn't talk about it again, and the trips continued, and I told myself the ceiling had held. The second stage came 4 months later in August, when I found an unusual pattern in our joint personal account, not Ashgrove Holdings books, which I had no access to and no reason to look at, but our own household finances, the account where his salary and my consulting fees both landed. A transfer of $18,000 had gone out to an account I didn't recognize, labeled only with a reference number, no name attached. When I asked Julian about it, he told me it was a reimbursement to his father for a family trip deposit that had fallen through, a ski house in Beach Mountain that the whole family was supposedly splitting for the following winter. Why would $18,000 come out of our account instead of yours? I asked. If it's a family expense your father's handling? Because my father asked me to route it, and I said yes, because that's what happens when you're part of this family, Ren. You do things without needing a spreadsheet to justify them. It was a strange thing to say to a forensic accountant, and I remember noting at the time how quickly he'd turned my question about a transfer into a question about my character. That's a pattern too, once you learn to see it. Make the person asking the question feel like the problem is that they asked at all. I called his mother Delphine a few weeks later, under the guise of asking about holiday planning, and mentioned the ski house casually. She had no idea what I was talking about. We haven't discussed Beach Mountain in years, dear, she said. Not since your father-in-law decided it wasn't a good investment. I didn't confront Julian with that discrepancy directly. I told myself I needed more information first, that a single contradicted detail from an 81-year-old woman's memory wasn't proof of anything, that I was, once again, at risk of turning my marriage into an audit because auditing was the only language I fully trusted. I opened a private folder on my laptop instead, one Julian didn't have the password to, and I started writing dates down. Just dates, at first, nothing more. The third stage arrived in October, 5 months into my pregnancy with Ivy. On a night I had a blood pressure scare that sent me to urgent care alone at 11 at night, gripping the steering wheel with hands that wouldn't stop shaking, because Julian was in Asheville for what he'd called an emergency site inspection. I called him twice from the waiting room. He didn't pick up until almost midnight. I'm sorry, I was in a meeting with the lodge contractor, he said, when he finally called back. Is everything okay? Is the baby okay? The baby's fine, I said. My blood pressure spiked. They wanted to monitor me for a few hours. I would have liked you to be reachable. You know how spotty the signal is up there, he said. I'll be back Thursday. I sat in that fluorescent lit waiting room, my daughter kicking against my ribs, and I thought, not for the first time, that a man managing a residential lodge parcel 2 hours from Charlotte shouldn't have spotty cell signal on a regular basis in the year we lived in, when I could video call my mother from a hiking trail in the Blue Ridge Mountains without a single dropped frame. I didn't say any of that to him. I said, please be reachable next time. And he said, don't be like this, Ren. I'm doing this for our family too. And somehow, in the space of one phone call, I had gone from a woman alone in urgent care with a blood pressure scare to a woman who was being like this, unreasonable, ungrateful for a husband working hard for their future. Sinclair began, around this same period, to make a habit of undermining my career at family dinners, always with a smile, always in a way that would have sounded like praise to anyone not paying close attention. Ren's brilliant with numbers, he'd say to guests. It's a shame that kind of detail work doesn't leave much room for creativity. Julian's always been the visionary in this family. Julian never corrected him. Not once, across 11 years, did my husband tell his father that forensic accounting required more creativity in a single fraud investigation pronunciation than most people used in a decade of their careers. He'd just smile and change the subject. And later, in the car, tell me I was too sensitive when I brought it up. He didn't mean it as an insult, Julian said, driving home from one particular Sunday dinner in November, the fluorescent glow of a gas station sliding across the windshield. That's just how he talks. He does it every time, Julian, in front of clients, in front of your cousins. You're pregnant. You're more emotional than usual. I'm not saying that's bad, I'm just saying maybe you're reading into things. I have thought about that sentence more than almost any other sentence he said to me in 11 years of marriage, because it was so perfectly engineered to end an argument without addressing a single fact inside it. He didn't deny that his father belittled me. He simply moved the entire conversation onto the terrain of my hormones, my emotional state, my reliability as a witness to my own life. It worked that night. It worked more times than I want to admit. There was a Thanksgiving dinner that same month, hosted at Sinclair and Delphine's estate in Weddington, that I still think about as a kind of hinge point. The moment I stopped being able to fully pretend the family's warmth toward me was unconditional. I was 8 months pregnant, uncomfortable in every possible way, and Sinclair raised a toast before dinner that began warmly enough, praising Julian's promotion, praising the coming grandchild, before turning, almost as an afterthought, to address me directly in front of 11 relatives. "And Ren," he said, glass raised, "we're so glad you'll finally have a reason to slow down a little. All that number crunching can wait a few months, can it? Family comes first." A few relatives laughed, the easy laugh of people who assumed it was simply an old man's affectionate teasing. I smiled, because that's what you do at a table full of people who love your husband more visibly than they've ever loved you. And I said nothing, because saying something would have meant becoming, in that room, the pregnant woman who couldn't take a joke. Later that night, in the car, I told Julian how the comment had landed, how it felt like his father was suggesting my career was a hobby I'd graciously be setting aside, now that the real work of motherhood was beginning. "He's from a different generation, Ren," Julian said, eyes on the road. "You know how he is. He doesn't mean anything by it. He said it in front of your whole family, Julian. He meant something by it. You're picking a fight over a toast. I'm telling you how it felt to be the only person at that table whose career got mentioned like it was optional." He didn't answer that directly. He turned the radio up slightly, a small, wordless signal that the conversation was over whether I agreed or not, and I sat in the passenger seat for the rest of the drive home, watching the dark fields slide past the window, filing the moment away with everything else I'd been filing away for years, telling myself once again that a single uncomfortable dinner wasn't worth the fight it would take to actually address it. The fourth stage happened in December, 6 weeks before Ivy was born. On an evening I came home early from a deposition that had settled faster than expected and found Julian's study door unlocked, his laptop open on the desk, a physical folder beside it that he'd clearly meant to put away before I got home. I wasn't snooping. I want to be precise about that, because precision matters in this kind of story, and I know how easy it is to make a wronged wife sound like she was hunting for evidence from the beginning. I walked in to ask if he wanted dinner, and the folder was simply there, open, on top of the desk, a single page visible. It was a property tax document for a parcel in Buncombe County, near Asheville, listing the owner as an entity called Larkspur Capital, LLC, the same name from the business card I'd found 4 years earlier and never fully investigated. "What's this?" I asked, holding the paper up. Julian came into the room fast enough that I understood, immediately, that I wasn't supposed to have seen it. He took it from my hand, gently, but with a firmness that had an edge to it I'd rarely heard from him. "It's a shell entity for a land parcel," he said, "for tax purposes. We use them all the time in the business, Ren. You know this. Every deal has 3 or 4 holding companies attached before it closes. Why does a shell company for a company deal have your handwriting on a sticky note that says M's School?" I hadn't meant to see that detail. It had been on a corner of the same page, a yellow sticky note with 3 words in Julian's handwriting, half covered by the tax document. He took the paper from me fully then, folded it, and put it inside a drawer he locked with a small brass key I'd never seen before. "It's a note about a mentorship program the firm sponsors," he said. "M is for the mentorship initiative. You're 7 months pregnant, and I need you to not spiral over a sticky note. I want to tell you I pushed harder in that moment. I didn't. I was 7 months pregnant, exhausted, managing a full caseload at Whitfield and Cross while preparing a nursery and fielding Sinclair's comments at every family gathering, and some tired, self-protective part of me chose to believe him, because the alternative was too large to carry into a delivery room 6 weeks later. I closed the folder in my mind, the way I'd closed the lingerie charge, the way I'd closed the $18,000 transfer, and I told myself I'd revisit it after the baby came, when I had the energy to actually look. The fifth stage, the one that finally cracked the ceiling all the way through, happened at my baby shower, 3 weeks before Ivy was born, hosted at my mother's house on a Saturday in February with pale blue balloons and a diaper cake my sister had spent 2 hours assembling. A gift arrived by courier that morning, addressed to me, no return name on the card, just an initial, V. Inside was an expensive baby blanket, cream-colored cashmere, with a small embroidered tag that read, in delicate script, "Welcome, little one." "Who's V?" my mother asked, holding the card up. "I have no idea," I said, and I meant it. In that moment, I genuinely had no idea, though something about the handwriting on the card felt deliberately formal, deliberately distant, the handwriting of someone who wanted to be seen without wanting to be known. My colleague, Priya, though I didn't know her yet by that name, only met her formally the following year, wasn't the only person who'd noticed something around the edges of the Ashgrove family's finances without having the standing to act on it. My own assistant at Whitfield and Cross at the time, a meticulous young man named Owen who processed my expense reconciliations, mentioned once, months before the shower, that he'd noticed my personal joint account statements, which occasionally crossed his desk when I was pulling comparison data for an unrelated case, showed a recurring pattern of round number transfers that didn't match typical household spending. Probably nothing, he'd said, but it's the kind of shape that usually means something's being smoothed over. I'd thanked him, filed the comment away with everything else, and told myself that professional instinct didn't always translate cleanly to personal circumstances, a rationalization I now recognize as one more brick in a wall I'd been quietly building between what I knew and what I let myself act on. I asked Julian about it that night. He glanced at the card for less than 2 seconds. Probably one of my father's clients. He has some overseas investors who send things like that. It's a status thing for them, sending a gift, having their name known in the right circles. There's no name on it, though. Just V. I'll ask him, Julian said, and he never brought it up again. And I never asked a second time, because Ivy was due in 3 weeks, and I had made a private decision, somewhere in the back of my mind, that I would give birth first and audit my marriage second. There was one more moment, 3 days before my due date, that I've never told anyone about until now, not even Margot, because for months I couldn't decide whether it belonged in the file I was building or somewhere separate, somewhere I wasn't ready to look at directly. Julian and I were assembling the crib together, an ordinary Sunday afternoon, both of us on the nursery floor surrounded by hardware bags and an instruction manual. Neither of us was reading closely enough. His phone buzzed on the carpet beside him, face up, and I saw the notification before he flipped it over. A calendar reminder. Milo's checkup, 2 p.m. Twos. I said nothing. He glanced at me to see if I'd seen it, and something passed between us in that silence, brief and total. The kind of silence where two people both know exactly what just happened and both decide, independently, not to be the one who says it first. Almost done with this side, I said instead, and handed him the next screw, and he took it, and we finished the crib in under 20 minutes without either of us speaking more than was necessary to complete the task. I remember thinking, that night, lying awake next to a man I no longer fully recognized, that I had just watched myself choose silence one more time, and that I was, for the first time in 11 years, disgusted with the choice rather than comforted by it. I didn't know yet what I would do with that disgust. I only knew, lying there in the dark with our daughter 3 days from arriving, that I wasn't going to keep making that particular choice for very much longer. Quick pause from the story. If you enjoy these stories, consider taking a listen to our Spotify show, linked in the description, for early access to new stories in better audio quality. Now back to the video. I gave birth to Ivy on a Tuesday in March, after 22 hours of labor, at 6:52 in the morning, weighing 6 pounds and 11 ounces, with a full head of dark hair that made the delivery nurse laugh out loud when she was born. Julian was in the room for the delivery. I want to be fair about that, because fairness matters, even in a story like this one. He held my hand through the last 4 hours of pushing. He cried when they laid her on my chest, or at least his eyes were wet. And for exactly 2 hours, I believed we were about to become the family I'd always imagined we would. Then he left the room to make a phone call, and came back in his gray coat, and told me about Vivian and the boy. And by the time Margot Delacroix called me that night about my uncle's estate, something in me that had been sleeping for 11 years was already quietly waking up. I had known Theo Bramwell since our first year together at Whitfield and Cross, back when we were both junior associates sharing a cubicle wall and splitting the cost of bad coffee from the machine on the 4th floor. He'd since become one of the firm's senior analysts, specializing in exactly the kind of shell company tracing that took most investigators weeks and took Theo, on a good day, about 48 hours. I called him from the hospital the morning after Julian left, my voice steadier than I expected it to be, and asked him for an unofficial favor. I need everything you can find on an entity called Larkspur Capital, I said, registered somewhere in North Carolina, possibly Buncombe County, and I need to know who's behind it. Ren, is this personal or professional? Both, I said, but keep it off the books for now. I'll make it official once I know what I'm looking at. It took Theo 3 days. He called me on a Wednesday evening while I was sitting in the nursery rocking chair with Ivy asleep against my shoulder, and I could hear in the careful way he cleared his throat before speaking that whatever he'd found was worse than either of us had expected. Larkspur Capital LLC was registered 18 months ago, he said. Buncombe County filing. The registered agent is a paralegal at a firm that does a lot of shell entity work for wealthy families, so that part isn't unusual on its own. But the beneficial owner listed on the operating agreement, the actual human being who controls the LLC, is a woman named Vivian Calloway. I didn't say anything for a moment. Ivy shifted against my shoulder, made a small sound, settled again. Vivian, I said. Julian's Vivian. I don't know whose Vivian she is, Theo said carefully. I just know whose name is on the paperwork. Ren, I also traced the money moving into that LLC, and I think you should sit down for this part if you're not already sitting. I was sitting. I told him to keep going. Over the last 31 months, Ashgrove Holdings has transferred a total of $2.3 million into Larkspur Capital's operating account, he said. Every single transfer is labeled the same way in the general ledger. Consulting fees, market Market analysis, Western NC expansion. There's no contract on file, no deliverables, no invoices matching any actual consulting work I could find evidence of. It's just money, moving on a schedule, into an account controlled by one person. Where did it go? About 1.4 million of it bought a property outside Asheville, not the lodge parcel, a private residence, 5 acres on Deer Lake Road. I pulled the deed. It closed 14 months ago, held under Larkspur Capital, no mortgage, paid in cash. The rest of the money, close to $800,000, moved into a trust account at Briarcliff Trust Services 11 months ago. The trust beneficiary is listed as a minor. First name Milo. I closed my eyes. Somewhere in the back of my mind, a sticky note that said M's school rearranged itself into something I could finally read correctly. There's a pattern in the timing too, Theo said, before I could respond. The transfers cluster around the 15th and the last business day of the month, which is standard payroll-adjacent scheduling, the kind of timing someone uses specifically so a recurring transfer doesn't stand out against normal operating cash flow. Whoever set this up understood exactly how to make $2.3 million look boring to anyone glancing at a monthly statement. That's not amateur concealment, Ren. That's someone who's watched a lot of ledgers get audited and knows precisely what auditors are trained to skim past. Sinclair, I said. I can't prove intent from a spreadsheet, Theo said. I can only tell you the structure has his fingerprints all over it, in the sense that it's exactly how Ashgrove Holdings has always disguised its more sensitive internal allocations, going back to deals I worked on myself years ago, before I understood what I was looking at. 4 wire transfers in particular caught my attention, Theo continued. They're larger than the others, and they don't have Julian's authorization code on them. They have his father's. Sinclair signed them. Sinclair signed them, Theo confirmed, which means, at minimum, your father-in-law knew exactly what this money was for and helped move it. Ren, I want to say this clearly, because I think you need to hear it from someone who does this professionally, and not just as your friend. This isn't a family disagreement anymore. Diverting corporate funds through a shell entity, disguised as consulting fees, to purchase real estate and fund a trust for an undisclosed dependent, that's not a gray area. Depending on how the board's fiduciary documents are structured, this could be wire fraud. It could be securities fraud, if any of that money touched investor capital, instead of pure operating funds. This is the kind of file that ends careers, Ren, possibly worse than careers. I thanked him, and I hung up, and I sat in the dark nursery for a long time, listening to my daughter breathe, thinking about the 2 hours Julian had spent holding her before he ever mentioned the word Vivian, and the 11 years before that in which I'd talked myself out of every single piece of evidence that had ever crossed my path. I called Margot the next morning and told her what Theo had found. There was a long pause on her end of the line. This changes the calculus significantly, she said. Your uncle's residual partnership stake gives you standing to demand information most outside parties couldn't touch. Combined with what your colleague found, we're not just talking about an inheritance dispute anymore. We're talking about a fiduciary breach at the highest level of the company, potentially by the chairman himself. What do I do with it? I asked. You let the board see it, Margot said. All at once in the room with counsel present, so no one has time to spin the story before the facts land. Thursday, 14th floor, I'll draft the exhibits. By Wednesday night, Margot had a binder 3 inches thick sitting on my kitchen table. Deed records, wire transfer logs, the Larkspur operating agreement, the Briarcliff Trust documents, a partnership stake certificate from 1994 that my Uncle Gerald had kept folded inside a fireproof box in his garage for 31 years, waiting, without ever telling anyone, for a day exactly like this one. I read every page twice. I fed Ivy at 11, and again at 2, and somewhere around 3 in the morning, sitting in the rocking chair with the binder open across my knees and my daughter's small hand curled around my finger, I whispered to her, your father had 2 hours to choose you. He chose wrong. That's about to become his problem, not yours. Thursday came cold and clear, the kind of early spring morning in Charlotte where the sky looks scrubbed clean. I dressed carefully, not for Julian and not for Sinclair, but for myself, because I had learned somewhere in the last week that the way you carry your body into a room can do half the work your words are meant to do. I wore a navy suit I hadn't worn since before my pregnancy, and it fit differently now, looser in some places, tighter in others, and I decided I didn't care. I strapped Ivy into the carrier against my chest, because I wanted her there, not as a prop, though I understood even then how it might look to some people in that room, but because I genuinely did not want to be anywhere without her, not after everything her father had shown me about which of us he was willing to hold on to. Ashgrove Tower sat on South Tryon Street, 22 floors of glass and pale limestone that Sinclair had built in 2011 as a monument to everything he believed about himself. The 14th floor housed the executive suite and the main boardroom, a glass-walled room at the corner of the building with a view that stretched out toward the mountains on a clear day. I had been in that room perhaps a dozen times over 11 years, always as Julian's wife, always seated slightly outside the main table, close enough to be visible, far enough to be understood as decorative. This time Margot walked in beside me, and we sat at the table itself. 6 board members were already seated when we arrived. Sinclair at the head in his usual gray suit, a coffee cup in front of him he never touched. Renata Okafor, an independent director I'd met twice at holiday parties, a sharp-eyed woman in her 50s who ran her own hospitality investment fund, and had, I would learn later that morning, been quietly uneasy about certain expenditure patterns in the company's books for over a a year. Desmond Farr, the chief financial officer, a thin, careful man who kept glancing at his phone. Patricia Lindqvist, outside counsel, seated slightly apart from the others with a legal pad already covered in notes. Two other directors whose names I only half remembered from prior galas. Julian walked in last, 4 minutes after the meeting's official start time, in the same faded blue tie I'd bought him for our 5th anniversary. He looked at me first, then at Ivy strapped against my chest, and something crossed his face that I hadn't expected. Not regret exactly. Recognition. The look of a man realizing, all at once, that the version of events he'd been telling himself for weeks was about to collide with a version he hadn't accounted for. "Ren," he said, taking the seat across from me. "What is this?" "Sit down, Julian," Sinclair said before I could answer. "Let's not make this more dramatic than it needs to be." Margot opened the binder. "Before we proceed to the standard agenda, the board needs to review something time-sensitive. Ren Ashgrove holds a legal partnership stake in this company, inherited from her uncle, Gerald Voss, one of the firm's original 1994 founders. That stake was never formally dissolved." Renata sat forward. "I've never heard that name mentioned in any capitalization table review." "You wouldn't have," Margot said, "because it was never disclosed to the board, which raises the first question this meeting needs to answer. Why wasn't it?" Sinclair's expression didn't change, but I noticed his hand, resting on the table, curl slightly, fingers pressing flat against the wood as if bracing for weight. "Gerald and I had an understanding," Sinclair said. "That stake was effectively retired when he sold his controlling interest in 2003. This is ancient history, and frankly, I'm not sure why we're litigating a 2-decade-old handshake agreement in a formal board meeting." "Because a handshake agreement isn't what the side letter says," Margot replied, sliding a copy across the table. "The side letter, signed by both parties in 1994 and never superseded by any subsequent document, explicitly preserves a 13% founder's stake, non-dilutable, convertible upon triggering conditions that include," and I'm quoting directly, "any material misuse of company assets inconsistent with fiduciary obligation to remaining shareholders." The room went quiet in a specific way, the way rooms go quiet when several people are doing math at once, and none of them like the answer. "That's a convenient document to surface right now," Julian said, finding his voice. "Right after our daughter is born. Right after a conversation that was supposed to stay private between us." I looked at him directly for the first time since he'd sat down. "You made it public the moment you decided the appropriate place to tell me about your son was 2 hours after I gave birth, in front of hospital staff." "I didn't surface anything, Julian. I just finally opened the file I should have opened years ago." Renata's eyes moved between us, and I could see her recalibrating everything she'd assumed about this family in real time. "Let's move to the second exhibit," Margot said, and slid the Larkspur documents across the table. Desmond Farr, the CFO, went pale before she'd finished explaining what they were. He'd clearly seen the ledger entries before, in some form, and had either not questioned them or not been permitted to. "Over the last 31 months, Margot said, Ashgrove Holdings transferred $2.3 million into an entity called Larkspur Capital LLC, labeled in the general ledger as consulting fees for market analysis on the Western North Carolina expansion. There is no contract on file. There are no deliverables. There is no consulting firm that exists under that name anywhere in the state's business registry beyond the shell itself. The beneficial owner of Larkspur Capital is a woman named Vivian Calloway." "Julian," Renata said slowly, "did you authorize payments to Larkspur Capital?" His mouth opened. For 11 years, I had watched Julian navigate difficult moments with a fluency that always unsettled me a little, a smoothness that made even his lies sound reasonable. This time, nothing careful came out. "Some of them," he said. "Not all of them. I didn't structure the entity." "Who did?" Renata asked. Silence. Sinclair's jaw was tight now, the same tightening I'd watched Julian inherit from him across 11 years of family dinners. "This can be handled privately," Sinclair said, his voice dropping into a register I'd never heard him use before, stripped of its usual polish. "There's no need to involve the full board in what is, at its core, a personal matter. $2.3 million of company funds," Renata said, "moved through a shell company to purchase a private residence and fund a trust for an undisclosed dependent is not a personal matter, Sinclair. It's exactly the kind of matter this board exists to oversee." Patricia Lindqvist set down her pen. "I need to be direct with everyone in this room. If these transfers were misrepresented on the company's books, and if any portion of that capital originated from investor funds rather than pure operating cash, this board has a legal obligation to report the discrepancy to council and potentially to regulators. I'd strongly advise no one speak further without their own legal representation present." "Julian," I said, and the room turned toward me because I hadn't spoken in several minutes, and everyone had, I think, briefly forgotten I was the reason the meeting existed. 2 hours after Ivy was born, you told me you weren't signing anything for her. You told me about a son I never knew existed, and you did it standing at the foot of a hospital bed, still in your coat, like you had somewhere else to be. "Ren, I'm not finished," I said, and something in my voice made him stop. "I have spent 11 years talking myself out of every piece of evidence you ever left in front of me, because I loved you, and because loving you meant believing the version of events you gave me instead of the version the numbers were telling me. I don't do that anymore. Not for you, and not for this family. Whatever happens to Milo isn't his fault, and I hope he's taken care of, but I am done pretending I don't see what I see. You had 11 years to be honest with me," I continued, "and you spent every single one of them deciding, on my behalf, which parts of the truth I could handle. I could handle all of it, Julian. I always could. You were the one who couldn't handle being seen clearly. Sinclair tried once more, his voice quieter now, aimed less at the room and more, I think, at his son. Julian, you don't have to sit here and absorb this. We can step out, regroup, come back with counsel of our own. Sit down, Sinclair, Renata said, and the sharpness in her voice surprised even me. Your son is a grown man. Let him answer for himself for once. Julian's hands were flat on the table, and I watched them the way I'd learned to watch hands instead of faces, because hands, in my line of work, tend to tell the truth faster than expressions do. His were shaking, very slightly, the specific tremor of a man who had spent his entire adult life being protected from consequences, and was discovering in real time what it felt like when the protection ran out. I loved her, he said, and for a moment I genuinely didn't know if he meant me or Vivian, and I understood, watching his face, that he might not have fully known either. Julian looked at me for a long moment. I didn't think you'd actually do this, he said quietly, and it was, I realized, the most honest thing he'd said to me in years. No, I said, you didn't. That was always the problem. Sinclair's phone buzzed against the table, once, then again. He glanced down at it, out of what looked like reflex more than intention, and every trace of color drained from his face in a way I had never seen from him before. Not once in 11 years of watching him command every room he ever walked into. What is it? Julian asked, leaning toward him. Sinclair didn't answer. He stared at the screen the way a man stares at a car accident he's about to be in but can't yet stop. And Renata, sitting close enough to see the notification banner, read it aloud before he could stop her. It's from the State Department of the Secretary of State's Business Division, she said, frowning. Sinclair, why is the Secretary of State's office emailing you directly about a compliance inquiry into Larkspur Capital LLC? The meeting room emptied slowly, in stages, the way rooms do after something irreversible has happened inside them. I sat for a long moment after most of the others had gone, ivy stirring faintly against my chest, and I found myself thinking, oddly, not about Julian or Sinclair, but about the version of myself who had walked into that same building 11 years earlier as a 23-year-old bride, certain she understood exactly what she was marrying into. I wanted, for just a moment, to go back and tell her what I knew now, not to warn her away because I don't think I would have listened anyway, but simply to tell her that the numbers would eventually tell the truth, the way they always had in every other part of my life, and that she should trust that instinct sooner than 11 years. I found out later, from Margot, that the timing wasn't as coincidental as it looked in that room. Theo, 3 days earlier, following his own instincts as much as mine, had filed a routine anonymous compliance flag with the state's business division after noticing that Larkspur Capital's registered agent had a history of forming entities connected to 2 prior disputes involving misappropriated funds. It was a small procedural thing, the kind of flag that usually took the state weeks or months to act on. It had simply landed, by pure administrative chance, on the exact morning Sinclair was sitting in a boardroom watching 2 decades of careful construction come apart in front of 6 witnesses. The meeting didn't end so much as it dissolved. Patricia Lindqvist called an immediate recess to advise the board on next steps, given the disclosed liability. Desmond Farr excused himself and didn't return, and I learned within the week that he'd hired his own outside counsel, worried, reasonably, about his own exposure for having processed transfers he should have flagged years earlier. Renata stayed in the room after most of the others filed out, and she came around the table to where I was sitting, Ivy asleep against my chest through the entire meeting in the specific, oblivious way newborns sleep through the worst days of their parents' lives. I want you to know, Renata said, that I had suspicions about those transfer patterns for over a year. I raised it once, informally, with Desmond, and I was told it was pre-approved capital allocation, nothing requiring board-level review. I should have pushed harder. I'm sorry I didn't. You're pushing now, I said. I am, she said, for whatever that's worth to you at this point. It was worth more than she probably realized. In the weeks that followed, Renata became something I hadn't expected to find inside that family. An ally with institutional power, someone with both the standing and the will to make sure the board's internal investigation didn't quietly evaporate the way Sinclair clearly hoped it would. She pushed for an independent forensic audit conducted by a firm with no prior relationship to Ashgrove Holdings, and insisted, over Sinclair's objections, that the results be shared in full with all directors rather than summarized by internal counsel. Sinclair, for his part, spent the first week after the board meeting attempting exactly what Renata had predicted he would attempt: containment. He called me twice on a number he shouldn't have had after I'd changed my phone, and left messages with a tone I'd never heard from him before, something closer to pleading than command. Ren, this doesn't have to go further than it already has, he said in the second message, which I saved, out of habit, the way I save everything relevant to a file. Think about what a prolonged investigation does to Ivy's future. Think about what it does to the family name she's going to carry. We can resolve this quietly, in a way that protects everyone, including you. I didn't call him back. I forwarded the message to Margot instead, and she told me with something close to satisfaction in her voice that an attempt to pressure a whistleblowing shareholder into silence, especially one framed around implicit threats to a minor child's future, was not going to help Sinclair's position with the board, or with the state investigators who had, by that point, formally opened an inquiry. Julian moved out of the house 11 days after Ivy was born, into a corporate apartment the company kept for visitors visiting executives, a detail I found darkly appropriate given everything else. He asked in the first week if we could try to work things out privately before any of this became, in his words, irreversible. I told him some things had already become irreversible the moment he decided a hospital room was the right place to tell me his true priorities, and that a private conversation 11 days later wasn't going to undo 11 years of small, accumulating lies. He filed for what he called an amicable separation. I filed for divorce 3 weeks later, citing the standard grounds, and requested primary custody of Ivy, with supervised visitation pending the outcome of both the state's compliance investigation and a separate paternity and support matter. I learned, through Margot, that Vivian had independently initiated against Julian on Milo's behalf months before Ivy was even born. That detail, when it surfaced, complicated the story in a way I hadn't expected, and I think it's important to include because I don't believe the truth is served by making every person in this story into either a villain or a victim with no gray space between them. I never met Vivian Calloway. I know her only through documents and through a single conversation Margot had with her attorney during the discovery process. What emerged was a woman who had worked as marketing director at Ashgrove Holdings for 4 years, who had entered into a relationship with Julian that began, by her own account, 18 months before Ivy was conceived, and who had been told repeatedly by both Julian and, more troublingly, by Sinclair directly, that the arrangement being built around her and Milo, the house on Deer Lake Road, the trust fund, the consulting fee payments that were, in reality, closer to a private allowance, was a fully sanctioned, above-board arrangement that the family had agreed to as part of Julian's eventual transition once his marriage to me had, in Sinclair's words to her, run its natural course. I don't say this to excuse her. She made a choice to enter a relationship with a married man, and she made choices afterward that caused real harm to me and, eventually, to her own son, who will grow up carrying the weight of decisions he had no part in making. But I understood, reading her attorney's filings, that she had also been managed in her own way by the same man who had spent 2 decades managing me. Sinclair had built an entire architecture of quiet manipulation around his son's affair, structured it through shell companies and trust documents specifically because he believed, correctly as it turned out, that the appearance of formal structure would keep everyone involved compliant, patient, and quiet indefinitely. Vivian wasn't a co-conspirator in the way I initially assumed. She was, in some ways, another person Sinclair had quietly decided how to use. The independent audit Renata pushed through took 11 weeks and confirmed everything Theo had found in 3 days, plus considerably more. The total misappropriated funds, once the audit team traced every related transfer back to 2022, came to just under $3.1 million, not the $2.3 million Theo had initially identified, because Sinclair had structured 2 additional smaller transfers through a second shell entity the year before Larkspur was formed, a fact he had apparently forgotten I would eventually have full access to as a partial owner of the company myself. The independent audit itself was conducted by a firm out of Atlanta called Bellwether Reeves, chosen specifically at Renata's insistence, because they had no prior consulting relationship with Ashgrove Holdings and no partners who'd ever attended the same country club functions as Sinclair. Their lead investigator, a methodical woman named Astrid Cole, requested full access not just to the Larkspur transfers Theo had already traced, but to every related party transaction logged over the preceding 5 years, a scope Sinclair's own counsel fought to narrow and ultimately failed to. I sat in on 2 of the review sessions, not as a forensic accountant this time, but as a partial owner exercising my right to observe, and there was a strange, dislocating quality to watching Astrid's team work through the exact methodology I used every day in my own practice, applied this time to the family whose dinner table I'd sat at for over a decade. It was during that audit that a second pattern surfaced, smaller than Larkspur but no less deliberate, a set of consulting invoices going back to 2019, paid to a firm called Hollis Bridge Advisory, which existed almost entirely on paper. Its sole listed employee, a former Ashgrove Holdings paralegal who had left the company under vague circumstances 3 years earlier. The invoices totaled just over $400,000, and Astrid's team traced the eventual destination of those funds to a private school tuition account, though not this time connected to Milo. It was, as it turned out, tuition for Sinclair's step-grandson from a previous relationship of Delphine's late brother, a boy Sinclair had apparently decided, unilaterally and without board approval, deserved a benefit the company's actual shareholders had never voted to extend. It wasn't fraud on the same scale as Larkspur. It was, in its own way, more revealing because it showed a pattern rather than a single lapse. A man who had spent decades treating the company's resources as an extension of his personal discretion, structuring the appearance of legitimate business expense around whatever obligation, affection, or leverage he happened to be managing that year. The board voted 6-1 to remove Sinclair as chairman pending the outcome of the state investigation, with Sinclair himself casting the lone dissenting vote. He remained on the board in a diminished capacity, stripped of signing authority over any account exceeding $50,000, a humiliation I suspect cut deeper for him than almost anything else that happened that spring. Julian was placed on unpaid leave from his vice president position, officially pending review, a phrase everyone in that building understood meant something closer to permanent. The family family fractured along lines I hadn't fully anticipated. Delphine, Julian's mother, called me the week after the board meeting, her voice thin and careful over the phone. "I want you to know I didn't know," she said, "about any of it. Not the boy, not the money, not the house. I want you to believe that, even if you have no reason to." I did believe her, mostly because of what she said next, which was that she'd suspected for years that Sinclair kept financial matters compartmentalized from her deliberately, ever since an incident early in their marriage when she'd questioned an expenditure and he'd told her, in a tone she still remembered clearly 30 years later, that finances were not a wife's concern. I recognized the shape of that sentence. I'd heard versions of it myself, dressed in gentler language, for 11 years. Delphine began coming by to see Ivy on her own, without Julian, without mentioning Sinclair, bringing small gifts and sitting in my kitchen for an hour at a time, mostly in silence, sometimes crying quietly when she thought I wasn't looking. I let her come. Ivy deserved a grandmother who wasn't complicit in the thing that had almost defined her childhood before it began, and Delphine, whatever her failures of awareness over 3 decades of marriage, had clearly never been given the tools or the permission to look closer. There was a specific evening, about 6 weeks after the board meeting, that I think of now as the quiet center of that entire period. I had put Ivy down for the night, and I sat alone in the nursery in the same rocking chair where I'd first understood the shape of what Julian had done, and I let myself grieve, fully, for the first time since the hospital. Not for Julian exactly, for the version of him I had married, or believed I had married, at 23, in a garden venue his father had paid for as an investment I hadn't understood I was part of. For the 11 years I'd spent building a life around a man who had, apparently, been quietly building a second life the entire time, on a parallel track, funded by the same company where I'd once believed my own career, my own analytical mind, made me an equal partner in our shared future. I grieved the specific, ordinary things, the trips we'd taken, the small jokes we'd had, the way he used to make coffee for me every morning without being asked, before the promotions, before the trips to Asheville, before whatever had shifted in him or been shifted in him by a father who treated love and leverage as interchangeable currencies. I let myself cry that night, quietly, so I wouldn't wake Ivy, and I understood, somewhere in the middle of it, that grief and clarity aren't opposites. You can know, completely, that leaving was the only correct decision, and still more in the years you spent believing you wouldn't have to make it. The financial and legal aftermath stretched on for months. The divorce settlement, finalized in late summer, granted me primary custody of Ivy, with Julian receiving supervised visitation 2 weekends a month, contingent on the outcome of the state's ongoing inquiry into his role in the fund diversion. The state investigation itself moved slowly, the way these things do, but by early autumn, Sinclair had agreed to a settlement with the Department of the Secretary of State's Business Division, admitting no criminal wrongdoing but paying a substantial civil penalty and agreeing to a 5-year prohibition on serving as an officer of any entity registered in the state. Julian avoided criminal charges, largely because the transfers he'd personally authorized fell under the threshold prosecutors considered worth pursuing, given the larger settlement already reached with his father. But he resigned from Ashgrove Holdings entirely in October, taking a position, I heard through mutual acquaintances, at a much smaller firm in Raleigh, doing work considerably less glamorous than what he'd left behind. My partnership stake, once formally recognized by the board's legal counsel, converted under the terms of my Uncle Gerald's original 1994 side letter into a buyout valued, after independent appraisal, at just over $6 million, a number that still, months later, sometimes makes me put down whatever I'm holding and sit very still for a moment. I used a portion of it to buy out the Elmhurst house fully, in my name alone. I put the rest into a trust for Ivy and into my own independent practice, a small forensic accounting firm I opened in November with Theo as my first hire, specializing with a specific kind of quiet satisfaction I don't think I need to explain, in tracing exactly the kind of hidden transfers that had once nearly slipped past me in my own marriage. Sinclair did not go quietly through any of it, not in the way the board's official minutes might suggest. In the weeks between his removal as chairman and the state's eventual settlement, he made what I can only describe now as a series of increasingly desperate final moves, each one revealing a little more of the man underneath the polish I'd spent 11 years mistaking for substance. The first move came in April, less than a month after the board meeting, when his attorney contacted Margot with an offer to purchase my inherited partnership stake outright, at a valuation roughly 40% below what an independent appraisal would later confirm it was actually worth. The offer came with a non-disclosure clause so extensive it would have barred me from ever discussing the Larkspur transfers publicly, professionally, or even, as one clause specifically noted, in the context of personal memoir or narrative writing, a phrase Margot found so absurdly specific that she read it aloud to me twice, laughing, before we declined it in writing within 48 hours. The second move came in May, when Sinclair attempted to reach Ivy's pediatrician's office directly, requesting medical records under a claim of grandparental concern, an attempt Margot later characterized, in a formal cease and desist letter, as a transparent effort to manufacture a custody or welfare narrative that might distract from the ongoing financial investigation. The pediatrician's office, to their credit, refused the request outright and flagged it in Ivy's file, and I remember reading Margot's account of the incident and and feeling something in me go very cold and very still. The specific stillness of a person realizing exactly how far another person is willing to go. The third move, and the one that finally, I think, cost him whatever residual support he still had among the remaining board members, came in June, when it emerged through the independent audit that Sinclair had attempted to quietly liquidate a separate reserve account 2 weeks after the initial board meeting, transferring $900,000 into a personal account held jointly with Delphine, without her knowledge or signature, using a power of attorney document she had signed years earlier for an unrelated medical emergency, and had apparently forgotten still existed. Delphine discovered the transfer only because her own bank flagged the unusual activity, and called her directly to confirm it. She called me that same afternoon, her voice shaking in a way I hadn't heard from her before. "He used my name," she said. "After 30 years, Ren, he used my name like a spare key." That was, as far as I know, the final straw for whatever remained of the marriage Delphine had spent 3 decades maintaining. She filed for her own separation from Sinclair in July, a fact that made the local business press, given the Ash Grove name, in a way that clearly mortified Sinclair far more than the state investigation itself ever had. I found a strange, quiet satisfaction in watching a man who had spent his entire life curating his public reputation lose control of that reputation over the very same instincts: control, concealment, the treatment of the people closest to him as instruments rather than partners that had built his fortune in the first place. Vivian's paternity and support case against Julian resolved quietly, in a separate courtroom, around the same time my own divorce was finalized. I don't know the exact terms, only what became public through the court record, which established Julian's financial obligations to Milo going forward and confirmed, formally, what everyone in that boardroom had already understood by instinct months earlier. I think about Milo sometimes, a boy I've never met and likely never will, 4 months older than my own daughter, growing up in a house on Deer Lake Road that was purchased with money that should have belonged, in some form, to shareholders and employees who had no idea their labor was quietly subsidizing a second hidden family. I hope, in whatever complicated way a person can hope for a child connected to their worst year, that he grows up without the specific weight his grandfather tried to build the family around. The idea that love and money are the same instrument, and that the people around you exist primarily to be managed. Vivian moved, according to the last update Margot passed along through the attorneys, out of the Deer Lake Roadhouse in the fall, once the property became part of the broader restitution settlement and could no longer legally remain in her name alone. She relocated with Milo to a smaller place outside Asheville proper, closer to her own parents, and resigned from any further involvement with Ash Grove Holdings entirely, severing what had clearly been, whatever else it was, a professional relationship that had cost her far more than it had ever paid her. I don't know if she regrets the years she spent believing Sinclair's assurances. I know, if our positions were somehow reversed, I'd want at least one person in the story to understand that a bad decision, made inside a system specifically engineered to make it feel reasonable, isn't the same thing as a bad person. I try to hold that distinction for her, even though I've never met her, even though I likely never will, because I think it's the same distinction I eventually needed someone to hold for me. By late summer, the version of the Ash Grove family that had once seemed, from the outside, so solid and unified, had scattered into something almost unrecognizable. Sinclair, stripped of his chairmanship and facing a public separation from his wife of 31 years, retreated from most social and professional circles, resigning from 2 country clubs and a hospital board within the same season, according to Renata, who kept me loosely informed out of what I came to understand was genuine friendship rather than professional courtesy. Julian, in Raleigh, started over at a mid-sized firm doing acquisitions work considerably smaller in scale than anything he'd managed at Ash Grove Holdings, and according to the custody exchanges that eventually settled into a predictable rhythm, seemed, in the limited interactions I had with him, like a man still working out exactly how much of what had happened was his father's doing, and how much had simply been his own. I don't know if he'll ever fully answer that question honestly, even to himself. I stopped needing him to. I sat across from Sinclair exactly once more after the board meeting, in a conference room at Margot's firm in late June, during a settlement mediation session neither of us had wanted but both of our attorneys had insisted on. He looked smaller across that table than he had in the Ash Grove Tower boardroom, dressed in a suit that seemed to hang slightly looser on him than it should have, his coffee once again untouched in front of him. "You've won, Ren," he said early in the session, before the mediator had even finished her opening remarks. "I'd like to think that entitles you to some grace in how the rest of this plays out. This was never a game with a winner, Sinclair," I said. "You built a system to move money away from people who trusted you with it. I just happened to be the person with the training to see it clearly. Grace isn't really the word I'd use for what happens next. Accountability is. You have a child to think about, a family name she'll carry. Dragging this out publicly serves no one. I have thought about her," I said. "Every decision I've made since March has been about her. I'm not interested in teaching my daughter that the way you handle being caught is to ask the person who caught you for grace, instead of taking responsibility yourself." The mediator, a calm, unflappable woman named Judge Ferris, retired, guided the session back to the specific terms on the table: the civil penalty, the 5-year officer prohibition, the restitution structure for the misappropriated funds. Sinclair signed the the settlement 2 hours later, his signature noticeably less steady than the one I remembered from documents years earlier. And as he handed the pen back to his own attorney, he looked at me one last time. "I did love this family," he said. "Whatever else you believe about me. I believe you loved controlling it," I said. "I don't think you ever learned the difference." I didn't stay for the closing formalities. I collected my things, thanked Margot in the hallway, and drove home with the windows down the entire way, letting the June air move through the car until the specific tightness in my chest I'd been carrying since March finally, slowly began to loosen. I started seeing a therapist named Dr. QuokkaReads in May, on Margot's recommendation, mostly because I recognized, somewhere in the exhaustion of that spring, that I was handling an entire divorce, a newborn, a state investigation, and the launch of my own firm using the same tools I'd used to close out an audit, methodically, efficiently, with almost no room left over for actually feeling any of it. She asked me, in our third session, a question I hadn't let myself sit with directly. "You do this work professionally," she said. "You find hidden money for a living. Why do you think it took you so long to look directly at your own?" I didn't have a clean answer for her that day. I have a better one now, months later, though I'm not sure it's a comfortable one. I think I confused loyalty with blindness for most of my adult life in ways that had nothing to do with Julian specifically, and everything to do with how I was raised to understand love as something you protected by not asking too many questions, the way my mother had quietly absorbed decisions in her own marriage rather than interrogate them, the way I'd watched Delphine do the same for 3 decades before she finally stopped. I think, too, that some part of me needed my own marriage to be an exception to everything I understood professionally about deception, because believing otherwise would have meant admitting that the skill I'd built my entire identity around, seeing what other people tried to hide, had failed me in the one place I most needed it to work. "That's not a failure of skill," Dr. QuokkaReads told me when I said something close to that out loud. "That's what love does to perception, even trained perception. You weren't naive, Ren. You were hopeful. Those aren't the same thing, even though they can look identical from the outside." I still see her every other week. I don't know if I'll ever fully forgive myself for the years I spent filing away evidence instead of acting on it, but I've stopped needing to call that forgiveness in order to keep moving forward. Some things you carry instead of resolving. I've made my peace with that particular kind of weight, the way you make peace with a scar that stopped hurting a long time before it stopped being visible. The custody negotiations, in particular, dragged through a level of procedural detail I hadn't fully anticipated, even with my own professional familiarity with legal documentation. Julian's attorney initially pushed for a 50-50 arrangement, standard for a first filing regardless of the surrounding circumstances, and I remember sitting across from Margot in her office on a rainy Tuesday in April, reviewing a proposed schedule that would have had Ivy, at 11 weeks old, spending overnight stays away from me for the first time. I didn't object out of possessiveness. I objected because Julian had, by that point, moved into a corporate apartment with no crib, no changing table, and a visitation history before the board meeting of exactly 0 unsupervised hours alone with his daughter. Margot argued successfully for a graduated schedule instead, starting with supervised daytime visits and expanding gradually over 8 months, contingent on both a parenting course Julian agreed to complete and the resolution of the pending state inquiry into his financial conduct. It was the right outcome, I believe that fully, but it was also a slow, grinding process, full of court dates and mediator sessions and a specific, exhausting kind of paperwork that made the whole ordeal feel less like a single dramatic reckoning and more like a low, persistent hum running underneath every other part of that year. I found allies in places I hadn't expected. My mother, who had never fully trusted Julian, not since the wedding itself, moved into my guest room for 6 weeks after Ivy was born, without asking, simply arriving with a suitcase the day after the board meeting and announcing she'd be staying until I told her otherwise. She never once said, "I told you so," a restraint I've come to appreciate more with every passing year, and she took the overnight feedings on the nights I had depositions or client calls scheduled early the next morning, humming old hymns to Ivy in the rocking chair while I slept for the first time in weeks, longer than 3 consecutive hours. Priya, the young analyst Theo and I eventually hired at Voss Forensic Advisory, turned out to have her own quiet history with the Ashgrove name. Her aunt had done landscaping work for the family estate for nearly a decade and had mentioned, once, offhand, at a family dinner years earlier, that something about the household finances never quite added up, a comment Priya had filed away the way people file away things they can't prove and have no standing to investigate. When she interviewed for the analyst position and recognized the name on my firm's early case files, she told me, with a kind of nervous laugh, that she'd wondered for years whether her aunt's instinct had been right. It was a strange, small confirmation, delivered months after the fact, that the pattern Sinclair had built his fortune concealing had been visible, in fragments, to more people than any of us realized, for longer than any of us wanted to admit. The local business press covered the story in the careful, hedged language reporters use when a settlement has been reached, and no criminal charges have been filed. Phrases like internal governance dispute and resolved financial discrepancies, doing the work that words like fraud and deception weren't legally permitted to do. I gave one interview, brief and factual, to a business reporter named Coral Simmons at the Charlotte Business Journal, mostly because Margot advised that a single controlled statement would prevent months of speculative coverage later. more. I didn't mention Vivian by name. I didn't mention Milo at all. Some parts of this story were never mine to tell in a public forum, regardless of how directly they'd shaped my life. And I've tried in the years since to hold that same restraint even now, offering only what feels necessary to make the shape of what happened understandable and leaving the rest where it belongs, with the people who have to carry it forward. There is a particular kind of quiet that settles into a house once the worst has already happened and there's nothing left to brace for. I found that quiet sometime in early autumn in the Elmhurst house that was fully mine now, on an ordinary Wednesday evening with Ivy 7 months old and sitting up on her own for the first time, wobbling, delighted with herself, reaching for a wooden block on the living room rug while I sat cross-legged in front of her, half watching, half thinking about a deposition I had scheduled for the following morning. It occurred to me, watching her reach and miss and reach again, that I hadn't checked my phone in almost 2 hours, that there was, for the first time in longer than I could clearly remember, nothing I was waiting to hear back about, no unexplained transfer sitting unresolved in a folder on my laptop, no sticky note I was choosing not to fully read. The quiet wasn't victory, exactly. It was closer to the specific relief of setting down something heavy you'd carried so long you'd forgotten your shoulders could sit any other way. My practice, Voss Forensic Advisory, named for my uncle Gerald, whose quiet 31-year patience had, in the end, been the single most important inheritance anyone ever left me, grew faster than I expected in that first year. Word travels in certain circles, especially among people who suspect, quietly and without proof, that someone close to them is hiding something they don't yet have the tools to find. Theo left Whitfield and Cross to join me full-time in January, and by spring we'd hired a third analyst, a sharp, careful young woman named Priya, who reminded me, in her habit of double-checking every figure twice before trusting it, of exactly the person I'd been at 26, before I'd learned to apply that same scrutiny to my own life and not just other people's spreadsheets. I think about Sinclair sometimes, and I try, honestly, to hold something more complicated than simple contempt, because I don't think contempt tells the whole truth of what happened. He wasn't a cartoon villain twirling a mustache over a ledger. He was a man who had built an entire identity around control, over markets, over money, over the people closest to him, and who had, somewhere along the way, stopped being able to tell the difference between protecting his family and owning it. I think he genuinely believed, in whatever internal logic governed his decisions, that he was managing a difficult situation responsibly, structuring it quietly so no one got hurt, the way he'd structured every acquisition and every restructuring for 4 decades. He simply never accounted for the fact that the people he was managing were not deals. They were his wife, his son, his daughter-in-law, a woman named Vivian who trusted his assurances, a boy named Milo who would grow up carrying the weight of arrangements he had no say in. Money can't actually be structured around people the way it can around property. Sinclair spent his whole career forgetting that distinction, and in the end, it cost him almost everything he'd built. I saw him once more, by accident, in the spring following the settlement, at a grocery store on Providence Road, of all ordinary places. He was alone, pushing a half-empty cart, noticeably thinner than I remembered, and for a moment our eyes met across the produce section, and neither of us said anything at all. He looked, in that moment, less like the man who had once filled every room he entered, and more like someone slowly discovering how much of that presence had depended entirely on other people agreeing to be managed by it. I nodded once, the small, involuntary nod you give a stranger you technically know, and I pushed my own cart toward the checkout, and I didn't think about him again for the rest of that day, which felt, at the time, like its own small, private victory. Delphine and I remained close, in the specific, careful way two people build a relationship out of the wreckage of something neither of them chose. She sees Ivy nearly every week now, and last month, on Ivy's first birthday, we held a small gathering in the backyard of the Elmhurst house. String lights looped through the dogwood tree, a cake my mother had insisted on baking herself instead of ordering, and a guest list that, if you'd shown it to me 2 years earlier, would have looked like a list of strangers with no obvious reason to be standing in the same yard together. Delphine arrived early, carrying a photo album she'd quietly assembled over the preceding year. Pictures of Ivy from the hospital, from her first Christmas, from a spring afternoon in the backyard, each one labeled in Delphine's careful handwriting with the date and Ivy's age. I want her to know her family loved her, Delphine said, handing it to me at the kitchen counter, her voice low enough that it felt like it was meant only for me, even the parts of the family that got it wrong. Renata came too, a little later, in a sundress instead of the tailored suits I'd only ever seen her in across a boardroom table, and she brought a gift that made me laugh out loud when I unwrapped it, a child-sized calculator, pink and covered in cartoon stars, with a small card that read, "For the next generation of people who catch things other people try to hide. She's going to need a hobby eventually," Renata said, shrugging when I thanked her. Might as well be a useful one. Theo and Priya stopped by on their way to a client meeting, staying just long enough for cake, and Theo pulled me aside near the fence line, while Ivy toddled unsteadily across the grass toward my mother's outstretched hands. "You know," he said, watching her go, "I think about that phone call sometimes. The one where you asked me to look into Larkspur off the books. I almost told you to wait until you were further out from the delivery. I'm glad I didn't." "I'm glad you didn't either," I said. "I don't think I could have waited." Some part of me already knew I was out of time to keep pretending. My mother stayed until the last guest left, helping fold up the borrowed chairs, humming the same hymn she'd hummed through countless overnight feedings the year before. She caught my my eye once, across the yard, as Ivy fell asleep against Delphine's shoulder near the porch steps, and she didn't say anything at all. She didn't need to. I understood watching that particular arrangement of people who had no reason, on paper, to belong in the same yard together, that I had built something real out of what had broken. Not a replacement for the family I thought I was marrying into. Something else entirely assembled on purpose, out of people who had each in their own way chosen to show up. I keep that album and the small pink calculator on the bottom shelf of Ivy's bookcase. And someday, when she's old enough to ask real questions about her father and the year she was born, I'll show her both alongside everything else. Because I've decided I'm not interested in raising her on a version of this story with the difficult parts sanded off. Julian and I settled, eventually, into something that resembles a working relationship, more than anything resembling friendship. He picks Ivy up every other Saturday, drives her back Sunday evening, texts me photos from the park sometimes without me asking. I don't know if he's a good father yet. I know he's trying, in a way that feels, at least from the careful distance I've built between us, more genuine than anything he offered me in the final years of our marriage. Maybe fatherhood asked something of him that a career built around impressing Sinclair never did. Maybe it's too soon to know. I've stopped needing an answer to that question either. The same way I stopped needing to know exactly how much of what happened was his fault versus his father's. Some questions matter less once you've already built a life that doesn't depend on their answer. There was one exchange in early December that I think about more than almost any other moment from that first year. Maybe because it refused to fit neatly into the story I'd otherwise built about who Julian had turned out to be. He arrived to pick Ivy up for his Saturday visit, and instead of the quick handoff at the door that had become our routine, he asked if he could come in for a few minutes, just to see her nursery, since he'd never actually seen the room in its finished state. I let him in. He stood in the doorway for a long moment, taking in the bookshelf, the rocking chair, the mobile above the crib, shaped like small paper cranes my mother had folded one at a time over a weekend in April. He didn't say much. He picked Ivy up carefully, the way he'd learned to over the preceding months, and held her against his shoulder while she reached for his collar with one small hand. "I think about that morning a lot," he said, not looking at me, still looking at Ivy. "The one in the hospital. I've tried to figure out why I said it the way I said it, standing up, coat still on, like I needed an exit route before I'd even finished the sentence. Did you figure it out?" "I think I was scared," he said. "Not of you. Of actually staying still long enough to feel what telling you the truth was going to cost me. Standing meant I could leave the second it got difficult. Sitting down would have meant admitting I owed you the whole conversation, not just the version I'd rehearsed." I didn't tell him it was all right because it wasn't, and I'd stopped being in the business of telling him things were fine when they weren't. But I did tell him, standing in that doorway with our daughter between us, that it was the first time in 11 years I'd heard him describe his own behavior without immediately explaining why it wasn't really his fault. He nodded once and didn't say anything else, and I understood that whatever relationship we eventually built as Ivy's parents, separately, was going to be built out of small, honest moments like that one, rather than any single dramatic reconciliation. I didn't need the dramatic version. I'd already had my dramatic version, in a hospital room, in a boardroom, in a mediation session in June. What I needed now, for Ivy's sake more than my own, was just this: small, plain honesty, offered without an exit route already prepared. I think most nights putting Ivy down in the same nursery where I first read Margot's binder cover to cover by lamplight, about the 2 hours Julian spent holding her before he told me the truth. I used to think about those 2 hours with something close to rage. 2 hours of a lie, 2 hours he could have spent simply being present instead of calculating what to say next. I think about them differently now. I think those 2 hours were the last 2 hours I spent believing, uncomplicatedly, in the marriage I thought I had. And I think, strange as it sounds, that I'm grateful the truth came when it did, in that room, before I'd had months to build a whole second layer of denial around a family that was never going to be honest with me on its own timeline. I drove out to the small cemetery outside Matthews in late October, the first genuinely cold morning of the year, and sat for a while at my Uncle Gerald's grave with Ivy asleep in her car seat carrier beside me on the grass. I hadn't visited since the funeral. I'd told myself I was too busy, which was true in the narrow sense and a convenient excuse in every other sense, because the truth was that I hadn't yet known how to sit with what he'd given me without also sitting with everything that had unfolded because of it. He never told anyone about that 13% stake, not his sister, my mother, who might have used the leverage to smooth over 100 small humiliations across 3 decades of family gatherings. Not Sinclair, who clearly assumed, if he thought about it at all, that the old side letter had quietly expired along with Gerald's involvement in the company. Gerald simply kept it, folded in a fireproof box in a garage in Matthews for 31 years, without ever once cashing in whatever satisfaction there might have been in reminding Sinclair Ashgrove that he didn't fully own what he believed he owned. I used to think that kind of patience was a kind of passivity, the same quiet, absorbing patience I recognized uncomfortably in my own marriage. Sitting at his grave that October morning, I understood it differently. Gerald hadn't been passive. He'd simply been waiting for the exact moment his patience would matter more than his pride, and he'd trusted, without ever saying so to another living soul, that the moment would eventually come, even if he never lived to see it arrive. I don't know if he imagined it would be his niece, holding his stake in one hand hand and his own newborn daughter in the other, standing in a glass boardroom telling his old business partner exactly what he'd built and what it had cost. I like to think some part of him hoped it might be exactly that. "Thank you," I said out loud, to a headstone that couldn't hear me, in a cemetery empty except for the wind moving through the trees along the back fence. "I don't think I ever said that properly when you were here to hear it." Ivy stirred in her carrier, made a small sound, settled again, and I sat there a while longer before driving home, the specific kind of longer that isn't about accomplishing anything, just about letting a moment finish on its own terms instead of rushing it toward whatever came next. A woman came into my office in February, almost a year to the week after Ivy was born, sitting in the same chair across my desk where clients usually sit when they've finally decided to stop pretending they haven't noticed something wrong. She was maybe 10 years older than me, married 31 years to a man who owned a chain of auto dealerships across 3 counties, and she told me, in the careful, apologetic tone people use when they're afraid of sounding paranoid, that she'd noticed a pattern of transfers to an account she didn't recognize, and that her husband had explained it away twice already, and that she was probably overreacting. "I've been doing this a long time," I told her. "I have never once had a client come into this office because they were overreacting. I've had plenty come in 10 years too late, wishing they'd trusted the first instinct instead of the third explanation. You're not one of those, not yet. Let's find out what this actually is." She started crying, quietly, the specific relief of a person who has spent months being told, gently or otherwise, that her own perception couldn't be trusted, finally hearing someone tell her the opposite. I recognized the shape of that relief completely because I'd felt a version of it myself, sitting in a hospital bed with a phone in my hand and a stranger named Margot telling me, for the first time in 11 years, that my instincts about my own life were worth acting on rather than managing around. I opened a file for her that afternoon, the way I'd opened one for myself without admitting it, months earlier, and I thought, watching her sign the engagement letter with a hand that was still slightly unsteady, that this was probably the actual shape of whatever justice I was going to get out of everything that had happened to me, not Sinclair's diminished board seat or Julian's smaller title at a smaller firm in Raleigh, though I won't pretend those outcomes didn't matter to me. The real shape of it was this: a woman in a chair across my desk, believing, for the first time in longer than she wanted to admit, that the numbers she'd noticed were real, and that noticing them didn't make her dramatic, difficult, or too much like her job. It made her right. It had always made her right. It had simply taken someone else finally saying so out loud. There is a version of this story where I stayed quiet, where I filed the sticky note away with the lingerie charge and the $18,000 transfer and the boutique business card, the way I'd filed away every piece of evidence for 11 years, and told myself once again that I was being too sensitive, too analytical, too much like my job, and not enough like a wife. I think about that version sometimes, late at night, the way you think about a road you didn't take. In that version, Ivy grows up in a house with 2 parents who never fully look at each other, in a family whose wealth is quietly built on money that was never fully theirs to spend, believing, the way I once believed, that a marriage held together by silence is the same thing as a marriage held together by trust. I didn't take that road. I sat in a hospital bed with my daughter 40 minutes old, and instead of falling apart, I opened a file I'd been building without admitting it to myself for years. And I let the truth do what truth does when you finally stop protecting the people who lied to build it. I smiled at Julian that morning, not because I felt anything close to warmth, but because I understood somewhere in that specific stillness that the fight was already over. He had walked into that hospital room believing he held all the leverage, a secret son, a family fortune, a decade of my own silence to lean on. He walked out of a glass boardroom on the 14th floor of a building his father built 4 months later with almost none of it left. Ivy is asleep down the hall as I finish telling this. She doesn't know yet what her name will someday mean to the people who eventually ask her about her father, about her grandfather, about the year Ashgrove Holdings made regional business news for reasons that had nothing to do with real estate. She only knows the version of the world I've built around her since. A house that's fully paid for, a mother whose job is finding the truth other people try to bury, a grandmother who shows up every week with photographs and patience, and a father who is, slowly, imperfectly, trying to become someone worth the effort of trying. 2 hours. That's how long it took Julian to show me exactly who he was. It took me 11 years to finally believe it, and 1 hospital bed, 1 folder, and 1 boardroom to make sure he never got to decide what happened next. I don't regret the 11 years, not entirely. I regret the years I spent doubting my own math. I don't make that mistake anymore. In my marriage, or in my work, or in the quiet, ordinary evenings I now spend watching my daughter reach for something just outside her grasp, over and over, until she finally gets it herself. Something real was lost that year. A marriage I'd believed in. A family I'd once, foolishly, thought I understood. A version of Julian I'd spent a decade convincing myself was the truest version, instead of the most convenient one. I let myself grieve that, and I still do. Some nights, in the small, specific way grief settles once it stops being an emergency and becomes simply a fact you carry. But I built something on the other side of it too. A daughter who will never spend a single day of her life wondering if her mother saw the truth and chose to look away. That's the trade I made, in the end. And 11 years later, I'd make it again without hesitating.